Welcome. We're going to start this with, don't be fooled by the distraction over there. We've got a lot of folks here, so we're going to open up some space while we begin the conversation here. But it's a privilege to be here today and to be joined by some fantastic folks up on stage to talk about autonomy and AI in a very relevant yet tragic situation in Ukraine. So with that, let me go ahead and allow folks to introduce themselves very briefly in the lens that they're bringing to the conversation, and then we'll jump into the particular dialogue and conversation. So let me start here.
Good morning, Alex Brand, the air attaché at the German Embassy. It's a privilege to be here with Preston, Sam, and Rita. I have worked, I would say, on both sides. So I have developed software for the Air Force, and I also worked on military policy related to artificial intelligence and machine learning and all that stuff. That should be
perfect.
So, Sam.
Thanks, Sam.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having us, and great to be on this panel with such distinguished speakers. I am an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security. I'm a full-time employee at the Russia Studies Program at the Center for Naval Analysis. I look at the development of Russian military technology, especially the development of military robotics, AI, autonomous and uncrewed systems. And ever since I joined CNA, I have looked at how Russia utilizes this technology in various conflicts and deployments abroad, starting with Ukraine, Syria, and now the Ukraine invasion. I look forward to talking about these issues with all of you. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Margarita Konaev. I'm the Deputy Director of Analysis at Georgetown's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, CSET. And I work on military applications of artificial intelligence and autonomy, and like Sam, a lot on Russian military technology, Russian military innovation. Really excited to have this conversation today.
Excellent, great. Well, I'm Preston Dunlap, founder of Arkansas Adventures, but prior to that, had the privilege of being the CTO and Chief Architect for the Space Force and the Air Force for a few years, which was a great honor and gave a sort of a lens to some of the conversations that we'll have today. In the general sort of trend of the conversation, we'll sort of start deep and as sort of tactical, and then we'll move up to operational, strategic, and then we'll think about moving forward as we work through that. Will be a QR code up on the screen if you didn't already grab it from the previous conversation. If you have questions, I will simply integrate those to the best I can inside the conversation. So don't delay sending those through, and we'll make those integrated in the seamless conversation as best as we can. So thank you for doing that and making sure the conversation we have is relevant to everybody here for you. So tactically, let's dive in. Everybody wants to know the answer to this. On May 3rd, just a couple weeks ago, 2 UAVs exploded over the Kremlin. Everybody wants to know, Atlantic Council, were you responsible for coordinating this attack? No comment from Rita. Okay.
No, none.
But seriously, so tell us about what happened and what do we think we know, and then the implications from that. Anyone can begin.
If I may, we know that there were 2 drones that basically penetrated the Kremlin airspace. One crashed into the dome, another exploded near the flagpole shortly after that. It is not known exactly what kind of drones these were. Ukraine does have the capacity to launch drones at such distances. It has several drone models, both domestic as well as imported. One of those imported models is actually a Chinese-made commercial drone, which can be refitted to a military mission. They can fly for hundreds of kilometers. So potentially Ukraine has the capacity. Ukraine has denied twice officially that it launched anything at the Kremlin. This could also have been actions of anti-Russian components inside the country that launched these drones close to Moscow, or it could have been something else. It's not exactly clear because the videos aren't very clear themselves. They're quite grainy. At the same time, this speaks to several major issues that Russia has to deal with. One is the basically widespread use of different types of military and commercial drones, and this use is quite unstoppable from Moscow's standpoint. Another is the difficulty of maintaining complete and total air coverage and air protection over such important VIP locations such as the Kremlin. In fact, there was evidence on Telegram channels that many Muscovites who lived in Moscow regions on its outskirts were witnessing these drones flying towards the center, they tried to inform the authorities, and either those calls were ignored, or there was a lack of coordination between local law enforcement and security in the Kremlin proper. So something did crash. These may have been the UAVs. They could have been launched by Ukraine to make a point, or it could have been an internal Russian action.
Well, let me add something which is not directly related to the Russian action, but to give the example what the Ukrainians did better, because they basically implied artificial intelligence so that anybody who is on the street, has a cell phone, sees the drone flying in, can take a picture, then that picture will be analyzed by AI, and then the Ukrainian armed forces will be informed like to take action against it. So that's something where they have been much better than the Russians. And if you take into account, I'm actually not sure what year that happened. Do you remember the German guy who landed as Chesner?
87.
On the Red Square. So obviously there hasn't been so much improvement on the Russian side since then.
Quote unquote, I'm not responsible.
Great. So since then, Russia's launched a pretty intensive 60-plus uncrewed air vehicle attack on Ukraine here in recent days. So that's sort of where we're at now. Let's scroll back the tape a bit, and Rita, maybe you want to begin with this. Let's go back in time to January 22. What was the state of autonomy and AI? If somebody were to say, hey, we're about to have a conflict here and Russia's going to invade, what were people thinking the state of AI and autonomy was like in terms of capabilities for Russia and Ukraine before the conflict started?
I think we thought that Russia had much more advanced and sophisticated capabilities that they demonstrated since January. Obviously, over the conflict, we've seen some adaptation, some ability to learn, some ability to, improve their approach. But there's no doubt that we in the community of Russia studies and intelligence more broadly have overestimated the capabilities of the Russian military. That is a lesson for us to learn, and probably a broader lesson for U.S. intelligence and estimations. I will speak for myself that when I was asked before the war started, what is going to be the role of, let's say, the Turkish drones? And I was convinced that they're not going to have a significant role because of the assumption that Russian air defenses are going to operate. That it was a lesson learned, both about the quality of the Russian air defenses, but also about the hardships of actually defending against drones and against significant attacks, drones deployed en masse, drones deployed unexpectedly, and increasingly just the understanding of how hard air defense is and how difficult it is to establish air dominance in a conventional setting. And I think that is one of the broader lessons to take away from this conflict that also applies to very much to the United States and NATO forces, is that we still operate according to the assumption that you can establish air superiority, because the last 20 years have been spent fighting against enemies that did not have much of an air force, or at all, and did not have much of air defense systems. We're in a very different world right now, and I think there are lessons to be taken from that. The other thing that, looking back when I was on this panel last year, one of the things that was important for me to kind of differentiate and make a point of is that there's a real difference between seeing a few very interesting, very compelling examples of AI being deployed, and I think there was a lot of press coverage for certain examples, to understanding what is the scale of AI deployment in this conflict and what is the actual impact. So looking a year afterwards, which is about a year and a half into the war, I think we're still at a point where it's difficult to judge scale, but we are seeing more and more evidence of impact. And that's particularly in the area of intelligence fusion. I think that is where AI has demonstrated itself to be a real advantage for the Ukrainians. So I'll stop here and let the others talk.
Great, and I do want to come back to dive in more deeply into the sort of the rate of change and the scale of transition here. So we'll put a pin in that and come back to that. But Sam, your perspectives on where we thought things were in the state of play and autonomy before and after. We'll talk about after.
I agree with Rita. Russian military showed a remarkable resilience and adaptation in trying to copy some of the best practices and best initiatives that were undertaken in the United States, China, and other countries. But translating that into actual combat effectiveness has proven quite elusive. Fast forward to now, all pieces are in place right now within the Russian military, for example, to take advantage of a lot of public data, public information, practices, tactics that have been so successful in Ukraine. Whether or not Russia's very vertical system, where the Russian MOD actually has the full control over initiatives, departments, how money is spent, how and what is allocated to what resources, whether the MOD can be flexible enough remains to be seen, and it probably will not be quite as flexible as the Ukrainian military has, because the Ukrainian military, Ukrainian government, Ukrainian defense industrial complex, Ukrainian volunteers, its high-tech industry, and the end users, the soldiers, have forged a remarkable network where they can speed up the delivery of certain products, goods, services, and actual weapons very quickly to the warfighter. Russia has tried to copy that. It has a very extensive volunteer base. There's a lot of initiatives within the Russian society that want to help their military, but getting through to the MOD, getting the permission to actually conduct a lot of research and development is really quite elusive. So in Russia, it's mostly the volunteers right now, which are coming up with very innovative high-tech solutions to augment their military. On the Ukrainian side, it's the entire network from the government down to the volunteers and practically everyone in between.
Yeah, let's widen the lens a bit. I think a lot of military analysts in January 22, and I wouldn't exclude me, would have thought that the Russians would pretty quickly crush the Ukraine armed forces, and that didn't happen. But because of that, I would say the Russians also thought they don't have to go in with all their, let's say, advanced technology. I mean, they have about 150, according to what your institution actually published last year, 150 projects, like weaponry projects with artificial intelligence elements, but they didn't use a lot of them in the beginning. They started later on to use more advanced technology, but in the beginning, as said, I think they assumed just it would be easy. And it wasn't, because the Ukrainians, as already mentioned, were quite creative and adaptive. And they, and I think that was maybe one of the pillars of the Russian mistake, that they assumed that they will basically act like the Russian military, because they have been for a very long time trained in that, and a lot of senior officers in Ukraine were trained in Russia as well. So yeah, the Ukrainians showed that they were able to adapt and implement this modern technology much quicker and much better than the Russian regular military, as Sam said before. I wouldn't say it's on par yet, so I see the Ukraine still in the lead, and hopefully they keep that.
Yeah, Alex, great point. So that's sort of the state of play at the beginning. Lots of activity happened at the very beginning, and as you alluded to, sort of illusions were sort of moved away with reality and how things would play out. Interestingly, in October 29th, if you recall, there was a fairly significant activity where something like, we don't exactly know the real numbers, but it's some, people say like 9 uncrewed air vehicles and maybe 7 surface vehicles or something like that attacked 3 ships in the sea, attacking the Russian Navy in the fleet there. Some sort of alluded that as a bit of a turning point, but I'd be, in recent history at least, that, as I understand it, and you can correct me, that is the first example in modern history, aside from things like torpedoes perhaps, of an uncrewed surface vehicle attacking in combat another asset. So I would love to hear your thoughts, panel, on to what extent did this adjust any thinking, tactically or operationally, and the significance of the combination of the surface and air strikes on those ships in the sea?
Well, should I start? Okay. I think, as already said before, the Ukrainians have been very creative in applying like new technology and use the stuff they had at their hands, and at the same time analyzing the weaknesses on the Russian side. And if you add then that the Russians also from a moral viewpoint or standpoint, so basically the Ukrainians are defending their home country while the Russians are doing a special operation, as it was called in the beginning. I would say that gave them the advantage. Technology-wise, looking how they combined that. Yeah, as said, I think it's a new approach. It was a good approach. I mean, they sunk the cruiser, the Moskva there, and yeah, we will, I guess, see more of this now, maybe to us unusual approaches in the future. And I mean, we are all talking about when does the offensive begin in Ukraine, so maybe we will see that very soon.
Probably one of the most important results from that attack by the Ukrainian unmanned surface vessels was basically forcing the Russian military to expend a lot of resources in trying to defend against similar attacks, which actually have happened again and again. And the Russian military tried to downplay the initial attack and the subsequent attacks, and they're saying that they have a lot of helicopters and aerial assets in place, and they're creating a single information network to share threat data, and they have a lot of nets and other defenses in port. But they have spent so much more money, so many resources on defending against something that's relatively cheap, small, and ultimately had very limited effect on the performance of the Russian fleet, which really wasn't very active in the first place. And so the whole point about using such unmanned technology is forcing the adversary to expend a lot of resources, whether in trying to destroy these assets or defend against them. And repeat attacks are going to force Russians to spend even more resources to stress out the Russian Black Sea Fleet defenses and to keep the entire peninsula of Crimea on edge as long as the war continues.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, we talk about how advances and emerging technologies can provide an asymmetric capability to forces that might be disadvantaged in manpower and resources, and that's a clear demonstration of that. Another angle I think here that's important is the signal value of something like this. And that's really important for the Ukrainian side because they need to show themselves to be effective, to be innovative, to be competent, and to be able to learn quickly, to utilize really incredibly innovative technology, to be on the edge of things in order to perpetuate continuous support from the West, because that is the lifeline for the continuation of this conflict and hopefully the end of it through Ukrainian victory. But it is through demonstration of capabilities like the ones that you described now that they are making a convincing argument for continued assistance for them. So the signaling value of using really sophisticated, even if cheap, emerging tech really matters.
Great observations. And last question, then looking back on the tactical, then we'll look forward and think about projecting where things go from here. But on sort of the reflecting backwards, Alex, I'd be curious if you want to start it, and then others can offer their thoughts as well. But tactically speaking, there are things that we watch and observe, and then there are things that we learn and will internalize for the future. And I was just curious, as you talk to allies and partners, to include your own fellow folks in Germany, how has the lessons been learned thus far in the conflict for those that are at the front edge of the fight around Ukraine in Europe? What lessons are you sort of noting that are being taken from what we've seen so far?
Well, there have been a number, I would say, of lessons identified. Not necessarily all of them have been learned yet. From an Air Force perspective, it's especially interesting that none of the sides, for a number of reasons, really strived for air superiority. And as Rita said before, maybe that on both sides there was quite a big arsenal of air defense equipment. That was one of the reasons for it. So well, and now I lost my the thread. So maybe some of my colleagues could come to the rescue.
We'll come back.
Well, looking at the Russian military a year and a half out, I mentioned that there's been some adaptation and recognition that certain technologies and patterns are absolutely essential. Russian military is trying to copy some of the best practices in the United States and elsewhere. For example, Russian military launched its own version of JAIC. It launched the main directorate for AI development, implementation, funding, and servicing. So this is going to be the central location within the MOD where all AI and autonomy projects are going to be reviewed, funded, and possibly implemented. There's also a main civilian AI development center launched by the Russian government, again, to organize the national development, research development, testing and evaluation of different types of AI technologies as well. There's a lot of screaming from the volunteers and the military on the solutions needed right now, but it is not clear if the MOD is actually listening. If you were to go to the Telegram and look at the dozens and dozens of Telegram-based channels talking about the war by the volunteers, by the fighters, they are talking about the very technologies that have proven so successful for the Ukrainians. Drones, quadcopters, artificial intelligence, command and control, C4ISR, and other issues. And again, is the Russian military actually learning these lessons enough to implement them, to push them down? Or does the Russian military remain this vertical organization where innovation, despite some of the successes and some of the examples that Rita alluded to, are actually possible?
Yeah, I would add, I think building on that, it's a real, first of all, there's a huge difference between lessons observed, lessons learned, and lessons implemented. And a lot of that is a bureaucratic conversation. And I think what is observed and hopefully learned, at least from the US perspective, is that command and control and the military culture matters in a massive, significant amount to how effectively you're able to use technology and how fast you're able to deploy it. Especially considering the role that commercial off-the-shelf technology has been playing in this conflict. If you have really rigid emergent control that is really, allergic to any sort of new ideas or new attempts at innovation, you're really not going to be able to move towards what we're seeing are essentially the trends of the war of the future. And if you are, again, opposed to sharing intelligence across the ranks, across different elements of the military, if you're incapable of learning from the innovation that the people on the ground are implementing and to do that bottom-up learning approach, then you're in real trouble. And we're seeing that in Russia, and I hope that is something that we truly take to heart as well.
So.
Yeah, and I think that's where the Ukrainians have been so much better, by just being, let's say, early adopters, having creative ideas, directly implement them, which is, and Sam said that before, which is not really typical, not only for the Russian military, but the militaries in general. I would say you won't find more early adopters than those people who like to do what they did the last 10 or 15 years.
Great, yeah, thanks for those perspectives. And I think hopefully people are getting sort of shaken and woken up to the potential changing nature of conflict, both the scale issue and the technological change, and whether we should sleep soundly or not with the trajectories that nations are on, both from a commercial and a national security perspective. That's an assumption that maybe the nature of conflict is more visibly changing. Let's unpack that a little bit. So we've talked looking back, now let's look forward. So pretty quickly at the beginning of the conflict, drones went from surveillance and ISR to then targeting and location coordinates for others, and then drone defense and drone on drone, and then drone kamikaze. So all the way kind of through the spectrum fairly quickly, at least in my view, in conflict. I don't know when the conflict ends, maybe you guys do, but let's fast forward to the end. What is the state of AI and autonomy when the end of this conflict happens?
I would say that's a pretty tough question, because it would require that we at least have a general idea on when and under which condition the conflict would end. I hope it ends soon, and of course in favor of Ukraine. I would also say that we would see an accelerated development as already mentioned, the Ukrainians are pretty creative, and the West is in support, and most Western governments already stated they will stay in support as long as it's necessary. I still see, because a lot of the supporters are also members of NATO. NATO has their artificial intelligence strategy published in 21 with the 6 principles, and I would say that most Western nations at least will keep it to that. So we will still see advanced technology in use in Ukraine, but I can't see application or implementation of autonomy, of total autonomy, so to say. So meaning that the decision is made by the machine, and then as one of the principles is like accountability and traceability, that would not be true then anymore. So my statement would be, we will see for the ongoing conflict more use of artificial intelligence and autonomy. However, it will be kept within the principles stated in the NATO strategy.
Looking at the Russian military in particular, if we zoom out, the Russian military discusses AI as a decision-making element, and at least for now, it places a human firmly in the loop for most of the operations. At the same time, Russian defense industrial complex and its AI research and development ecosystem are talking about artificial intelligence and autonomy enabling future war where human is taken out of the equation altogether, eventually. Probably mirror imaging what has been said and discussed in the United States, China, and elsewhere. But if we zoom in on what is happening in Ukraine, there are a lot of solutions, there are a lot of gaps, a lot of issues identified by the volunteers, by the warfighters themselves. And the question is whether or not the MOD, whether its departments and institutions are going to listen to, apply, and incorporate some of these volunteer-identified lessons learned into their concept of operations going forward. Of course, a lot will also depend on the state of the Russian economy and the Russian industry going forward. We don't know exactly when and how this war is going to conclude, but we do know that the war is having a very significant effect on the Russian high-tech ecosystem in general and on its economy and the defense industrial complex in particular.
Really great points. I would add that if we're thinking about AI development and the acceleration of AI development more broadly, the war is playing a massive role in that, not only because there's an opportunity essentially to battle test a lot of the technologies, including the ones that are civil, commercial off the shelves, but also the production, collection, and analysis and capture of battlefield data, which is massively significant, and that is the data upon which new and more presumably more precise, more reliable algorithms will be trained. And battlefield data is very difficult to come by. It's very difficult to analyze, and having it, which I assume the United States and NATO through their involvement are able to access, is going to be significant. And at the same time, I mean, it's pretty obvious that we're in a very critical moment for AI right now in the commercial space. This is the most I've heard about AI since in the last 5 years that I've been working on AI policy issues. We're really in a pivotal moment, both in terms of breakthroughs and in terms of what we're thinking about how these technologies are going to be regulated. So we have to think carefully about what are the applications of, generative AI to military operations. How is that going to be integrated with what is being learned from, the battleground, essentially? And I think the United States is really, the Department of Defense is in a critical moment right now where we decide essentially if we're able to integrate the innovation community with the larger, more legacy organization, and that's a conversation we can continue having.
Yeah, great perspectives. I think, and Rita, I think earlier you mentioned not just sort of individual use of technologies, but technologies at scale, sort of a larger operational employment of assets. We hear a lot about the uncrewed air systems over the years. Interestingly, there's significant commercial investment there, as each of you pointed out. Also in the ground vehicle segment, which we call self-driving cars, here in commercially, massive billions and billions of investment there. You're curious as we close out this looking forward tactical section, for your perspectives on looking forward, do you suspect and in what ways might we see increased collaboration across the air and the maritime use of autonomous systems? And to what extent and why have we not seen sort of an escalating trend in more uncrewed surface vehicles as well as autonomous ground vehicles? Do you think that will change, or is there a reason why we're not seeing sort of that same rate of change as we saw in the first few months of the conflict?
I would say that will change. So especially with regard to ISR, so reconnaissance vehicle, I can imagine very well that we will have ground-based vehicles doing that. It started in the air for some reason because it's easier to move around there if you have a bit more obstacles on the ground. But I also see autonomous vehicles with regard to logistics. That would also be a very good application to use that, like resupplying troops, maybe the last mile from the basically forward operating base to the actually warfighter. So to that end, I would see a lot of, let's say, advancement, and hopefully we have seen this in exercise, the combat warrior interoperability exercise NATO is doing, for example. So there are prototypes already, and we will see that fielded. And as Rita said before, with the ongoing conflict, maybe that's an option to say, okay, it can easily also be tested under battlefield conditions. On the other side, so back to aircraft, collaborative aircraft, I think at the moment, and I'm not a pilot, so my colleagues flying planes may forgive me, I think the current technology enables the pilot to become less a pilot but more a battle manager. So the plane basically can fly itself, not the fancy maneuvers Maverick can do, but at least it can fly straight level without crashing and maybe evade also some threats. But then the pilot has more time to make sure that with the collaborative aircraft, and that's what most nations are working on, so having unmanned and manned platforms teamed and like make them act to the most efficient and most effective way.
Alex is on the record for saying the end of the conflict will see Top Gun Maverick as the state of play.
So don't quote me on that. I wouldn't see that, but who knows?
Other perspective.
Ukraine has announced that it is working on several projects, including incorporating AI in various aerial and other military elements. They haven't provided a lot of details, but they pledged that soon we will see how artificial intelligence is enabling their manned and unmanned systems and technologies. Zooming in on Russia specifically, there's been multiple projects in development prior to the war and even now with respect to unmanned ground vehicles, aerial vehicles, and maritime systems. But the Ukrainian battle space is very complex. And so there's a lot of issues about actual autonomous operation in such a saturated Ukrainian airspace and battle space. There is, however, a very significant human-in-the-loop element when it comes to the Russian military's use of such technologies. They're using demining UGVs in the Donbass. They're using ISR and combat UAVs, including their own loitering drones. The extent of AI in some of these systems is quite questionable for now, but there's a lot of research and development, and there's a lot of evaluation of what Ukraine has done well. And as I alluded to earlier, can the MOD be flexible enough to actually get out of its own way to let the innovation step forward, especially the innovation that is coming from the bottom up, from the volunteers, from the soldiers themselves, who are ready to use a lot of these technologies? That is probably one of the biggest issues that at least I will be looking for this year.
Yeah, I hate to spoil the party, but unmanned ground vehicles, let alone autonomous ground vehicles, are a big problem. It's a big technical problem. And there's a lot of money obviously being poured into it, and there's a lot of interest in it. But from, demonstrations that my colleague here from CSAT, who used to run autonomy for the DoD, maybe, he can tell me if I'm fundamentally wrong, but they struggle off roads, and they struggle in urban, densely populated environments, and these are essentially most of the environments you're doing a lot of the fighting in. So I kind of, I think we're going to see a lot more AI-enabled and autonomous progression in the air and perhaps undersea, except for the much harder reach environments. But ground, to me, there's real hardware problems there to solve before we can see massive progress. And I think also in the near term, we are not talking about complete autonomy. We're talking about the importance of human-machine collaboration, human-machine teaming. And that is where a lot of the conversation about reliability and trust comes in. And I know, Department of Defense has been working about responsible and trustworthy AI issues, and I think that's really pertinent to how we're going to be employing this technology. But to me, the crux of what is going to be happening in this space is really centered on human-machine teaming.
Yeah, great perspectives, everybody. So I think each of you kind of alluded to there's the psychological and then the strategic messaging element of the use of AI and autonomy. And there's the tactical implementations of it. So let's think operationally, the so what of the question. So what are you all seeing the operational sort of end states that are making a difference or not making a difference in the conflict? So sadly and tragically, we've seen, hard to project, but New York Times on February 2nd basically estimated that close to 120,000 Ukrainians have lost their lives, maybe 200,000 Russians have lost their lives as a result of this. That's a cost of humans as part of this conflict, which is horribly tragic. From territory perspective, of course, we saw Russia grab territory coming in from Belarus in the north and then get pushed back over a couple months. And so they've sort of gone into a bit of a stasis on the east side of the country. How much of what we're seeing happening on the ground is the result of autonomous and AI activity versus traditional military activity?
I would say right now, very little with respect to the classical autonomy and AI as, for example, the scholars and the academics and as the military experts see it. Most of the activity on the ground right now is human-enabled. Humans are obviously in full control of the UAVs and the drones and other systems that they're operating and flying. There are certain developments sort of waiting in the wings, but it's unlikely that they're going to be fielded soon enough. Right now, most of the warfare in the east of Ukraine around Bakhmut is the classical ground warfare, which is enabled by ISR airborne elements like the UAVs, like the FPV drones, which are piloted and operated by humans. So there's very strong human-in-the-loop approach to what is happening right now with respect to the fighting.
Yeah, I largely agree with that. I think the one element, and I don't know if it's operational significant yet, but it is important to point out, and I mentioned this before, is the idea of intelligence fusion on the Ukrainian side with the massive support from the United States and NATO and companies that have openly spoken about this. So this is something that if AI plays a real significant role anywhere in this conflict, I think that's where it's happening. And we talk a lot about JATC2 and the whole notion of connecting sensors to shooters. I think this is some sort of an ad hoc, very rudimentary, but perhaps experimental version of it. We don't know the scale of it. We don't know, the replicability of it. But we are seeing those connections being made. A lot of it, like Sam said, human in the loop, very much involved. But at least on the intelligence processing and the combining of different inputs, I think AI is playing a meaningful role there, and intelligence is very important for war and at the operational and presumably at the strategical level. If the Russians had better intelligence, this war would have been over, or this war would not have even been started.
Yeah, I would fully agree. So in the ISR realm, I would say that there where most of the AI is implemented, and it may then trigger operational action or action on the ground, but it's not basically involved in the operation process at large then, after the intelligence has been delivered.
So that's operationally. Let's think now sort of strategically. So 2017, we have Putin saying whoever owns AI owns the world. After some of the Ukrainian operations with that combined activity in the sea with surface vehicles and air vehicles, one of the deputy ministers in Ukraine basically said we have a fundamental shift in the way conflict happens. We'll never see conflict again, sort of paraphrasing his quote there. But sort of strategically, are they right? Is AI at a place where there's a fundamental tectonic shift? And if you own AI, do you own the world?
A question difficult to answer, I would say.
That's why we brought the three of you here.
That's why you're asking it. Okay. As I said before with the principles, it's all about, and as also said in the keynote, it's about how you implement AI. I think it would be a turning point if our adversaries would switch to using full autonomous system. And then it's basically about if you do that and are able to employ them in large numbers, that would change a lot to my understanding. Hopefully we won't see that too soon, although, and also that was mentioned in the keynote, China is pretty ambitious on going that direction. So, yeah, I think I leave it to Sam and Rita to add a bit on that.
I think a lot of what President Putin was referring to is actually about the commercial side of things and the commercial application of artificial intelligence in the economy in general. And this is where, if we take an objective look at the state of the civilian AI developments in Russia, that's where Russian accomplishments are actually probably proving more impactful. In the financial sector, in the medical sector, in agriculture, and in other economic sectors, there are some significant AI breakthroughs. So much so that the Russian military now wants to use some of these civilian accomplishments for itself, and it wants to establish fusion centers and fusion cells where civilian accomplishments are going to be copied and pasted, so to speak, with the military if that's actually possible. So I think what the Russian president was alluding to were very significant breakthroughs that were happening in the United States and China. And Russia sees itself as a distant second to the race for the first place that is actually happening between the United States and China, who are investing so much more and have so much more to show when it comes to AI. It's not clear whether the Russian president actually believes his own statement right now, but he is actually making a lot of commitments to the development of autonomy, AI, and robotics in the military, even if right now we can't quite see any of those results on the battlefield.
Yeah, so I think obviously it's about how you integrate AI and whether you do it. Right now we're at a point in time where the most AI is giving us is a mild advantage in the speed of decision making that is then translated to a potential advantage at the speed of operations. So if you think about the acceleration of the OODA loop, we are kind of in the beginning stages of that, which is, at the margins is important. To call that a revolutionary, groundbreaking kind of change in the conduct, character, let alone nature of war, no, we're not there. Whether we're going to get there is going to be contingent on, once again, bureaucracy, but also on what we decide AI is important for. Is it particularly pertinent to speed and decision making and speed and operation? Is it critical for the fact that, precision? Precision warfare is a massively important element of how the United States fights. Is this an area that we're going to be prioritizing AI for? Right now, from what we're seeing, and not AI being involved, but if we're thinking about emerging technologies more broadly and the use of drones in combination with other assets, we're seeing Russia's emphasis is not obviously on precision or even speed, it's about mass. So to me, the way that I'm reading, Russia using whatever capabilities emerging technologies is deploying, it's using it to augment its existing capabilities, which is the ability to mass assets, to mass firepower, to mass manpower. That's one of the few things that it does well and does to a real effect. So if we're thinking, from our perspective, if we are going to be utilizing AI to augment known strengths, precision, speed, lethality, that's, potentially a really interesting development. But if we're thinking about augmenting, making up for weaknesses, which is our tolerance for loss of human lives, and we're going to be emphasizing greater delegation of certain tasks to autonomous vehicles and autonomous systems, that's a different approach. So I think we're once again at a critical moment of deciding what it is that we want out of AI and how we're going to be using it.
Yeah, it's a great segue too. So AI seems as sort of have a massive commercial play and the potential to have a massive sort of national security play as well. Whether we're on the cusp or how soon, sounds like that's a bit of a question mark. But we're seeing sort of clear examples of that on the battlefield right now today. So that's on the sort of opportunity side. On the risk side, of course, at the same time, we've got White House Bill of Rights sort of alluding to AI and other technologies posing among the great risks to democracy, quote unquote. We've got the EU, European Union, sort of looking tomorrow, I think, debating the AI Act that puts limitations and safeguards on there. That will be a point of, I assume, continued debate out there. How do we thread the needle of AI and autonomy through both the opportunities and the risks, while still having to be able to, in the national security context, be able to provide deterrence and, if necessary, defeat adversaries on the battlefield?
I'll say a few things real quickly. I am less concerned about the implementation of artificial intelligence in at least the US military than I am about the civilian sector writ large. The US military, in the end of the day, wants stuff that works. As such, they're going to be investing in reliable technology that is tested, that is proven, that is going to be useful and not dangerous, at least for friendly forces on the battlefield. At least that is the guiding theory, with also known obligations to abide by international human rights law and other humanitarian obligations. I'm more concerned about what is going to be happening with artificial intelligence in the commercial and civilian space, where there's a great push to let companies regulate themselves, at least, again, very different approaches in Europe as it is in the United States. And there's even if right now there's more of a conversation about potential regulations, there's reluctance on behalf of policymakers, whether it's because they're not necessarily familiar with the contours of the technology or because they don't want to stifle innovation. And we all know that policy is always lagging behind technological developments. So to me, right now is a pivotal moment in thinking how we regulate that technology, much more so in the civilian space, which of course will have implications for defense. But I think that we as responsible citizens of a country have a vested interest in ensuring that our representatives, the policymakers that we elect, take a very careful look at these issues and that it's not left to industry alone, because we have seen what happens when this is the pathway, and we've seen that with social media, to the massive detriment of democracy and society.
Alex, I think maybe this may be a good opportunity too for you to just briefly talk about, as an anecdote, sort of Germany's thinking about autonomy and the use of autonomy, and sort of how that sort of decision process came out.
Yeah, and maybe a lot of you know there has been quite a lot of discussion when Germany was considering to get armed drones, because there's quite a number of people in Germany thinking that that is like stepping over the line, and soon we will see then fully autonomous systems dropping bombs or shooting somewhere. I think what Rita said is very true. So the military wants working technology, and industry is, and that was already mentioned, is basically defining the pace. So it's not the military doing research and development and being in the lead, doing advanced. Most of the stuff happens in industry, and because industry tends to try stuff out. I mean, if you have a business case, people will try, and if you have venture capital to do that, you may see that, and then you may see others exploiting that for criminal cases or military cases, if we are talking then on the military side. So that's why also governability, like putting regulations on it, is one of the 6 principles I already mentioned. And in Germany, it took about 6 years to finally, then including a change in government, to find an agreement that we finally will get armed drones, which for the military, of course, because it's a proven technology, is pretty important. But it took just too long. We won't have the time in a conflict. But fortunately, although that has been recognized, so I hope that will, let's say, shorten the discussions in the future.
I think looking at Russia, we have to recognize that the Russian government is the biggest funder and sponsor of all major and significant innovation activity in the country, whether on the military or on the civilian side. Now that a lot of Russian enterprises, a lot of Russian initiatives are cut off from the global supply chains and they cannot interact with their counterparts around the world because of the sanctions, everyone is looking at the Russian government for solutions, for funding, for creating roadmaps, for essentially being the guiding light in the high-tech ecosystem, and for providing advice and opportunity to develop artificial intelligence and autonomy. And so the question is, can the Russian government actually deliver? Can it provide for its civilian non-government sector? Can it actually incorporate the right lessons in the military? Can it get out of its own way, basically, to let the innovation thrive, if that is the will of the people or if that is the will of the companies and organizations which are pushing a lot of this innovation and a lot of this development. And so right now, it's very difficult to see how the Russian government can be quite flexible and efficient in that, but there's a lot of calls on this particular Russian government to actually be flexible, to be innovative, to let a lot of the non-military, non-government solutions come to the fore and see if they can actually work.
So globally last year, depending on how you slice it, $46 billion perhaps spent on AI and autonomy, about $27 billion in the United States, about $3.5 billion of that from the US government. Russia, on the other hand, hard to project, but some say maybe $60 million-ish on AI and autonomy. We've got JAIC, which was mentioned, the AI Center, and now CDAO and the Pentagon. They've got their own sort of equivalents. Sort of briefly, in the last few minutes that we have, could you just offer a pathway ahead? Do we need more investment? Do we need to organize differently as an allied and partners in US community to be able to provide technology and enable our folks to have technology that they need in the areas of AI and autonomy? We'll start with Alex and then work down.
Well, the numbers in Germany are much lower, if I say so, but at least it's a one-digit billion figure. So I think it's an important field. So we may need more resources there because, as said, we have adversaries or opponents who are pushing on that field. Also pretty much. So on the other hand, you have to also take into account, okay, what's the outcome? So what is actually then proven technology where you see, okay, that's add values. I mean, in a lot of cases, we, not on the military side, but on the commercial side, we have already been used so much to use artificial intelligence. So where we are going, we are looking on our phones and they tell us like, there's a traffic jam here and that's the route you take, and then you basically save time and arrive earlier. So hard to give an answer, okay, this is the amount of money we would need, but as said, I think we should invest more in autonomy and artificial intelligence and maybe save some money by doing that in cooperation as allies and partners.
Sam, briefly, and then read the last word.
The biggest threat that Russia sees right now isn't just the United States acting alone, but the larger Western world acting together. And so the relationship with partners and allies in the development of AI and autonomy are extremely important. At the same time, we also have to recognize that a country like Russia has a government that is only responsible to itself. And so whatever government decides on will probably be implemented in one form or another. Its relationship with the civilian society is very different than the relationship between the US government and the US civilian society. And so what is important here is the dialogue and the alliance building and the sharing of lessons that have become so prevalent and so useful right now in the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think at least in the U.S. perspective, we know what to do. NSCAI published, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now, 700 pages of precisely what to do. A lot of it is, some of it has been implemented, some of it is sitting, in congressional committees or whatnot, and some of it has not even been touched. We have a good idea of what needs to be done. We simply just need to do it. And the last point is that there is right now a massive amount of learning that is happening at the tactical level in the United States military, and all of these interesting task forces, all of these innovation silos essentially. We gotta be asking, are they talking to each other? And even more importantly, are they talking to the broader military? And what is being done to take that innovation that is happening at the tactical level and to integrate it across the entire organization?
Yeah, I love that quote, which is a great one to end on. We know kind of what to do, we just have to go execute and do it. And the nexus of commercial and national security is here now. We just got to go out and make it happen. So please join me in thanking the great panel today.